Good evening and welcome to episode 9 of SlantCast, the official podcast of Slant Books. My name is Gregory Wolfe and I'm Slant's publisher and editor. We're grateful that you've chosen to share this time with us. Tonight, we're continuing to stretch our wings with yet another variation in our podcast format, and a very exciting one at that. We're going to be discussing a modern literary classic with the author himself. We're doing so under the shadow of a recently published expose in the New Yorker chronicling the decline and fall of the English major. A representative sample from the article might be this quote from a Harvard professor. Quote, "The last time I taught the Scarlet Letter," she said, "I discovered that my students were really struggling to understand the sentences as sentences, like having trouble identifying the subject and the verb." But you don't have to believe the sky is falling on the humanities to recognize that fewer and fewer people are convinced that an education based on reading that is both extensive and careful can be the foundation of a fulfilling personal and professional life. Nor is it mere apocalypticism to hold that the quality of our writing and reading, our creativity, and our capacity to exercise discernment relates closely to our capacity to read what's actually going on in the world and thus discern how best to strive for justice and peace. As an indie literary press, Slant strives to be a haven for writing that avoids every form of reductionism, every attempt to replace literature's exploration of ambiguity and mystery with high-minded didacticism, which would certainly explain why one of our heroes is Richard Rodriguez, author of Hunger of Memory, a book that is concerned with the often fraught and paradoxical relationships between literature and education and their impact on both the public and the private realms. The occasion of tonight's conversation is the recent reissue of Hunger of Memory in a 40th anniversary edition by David R. Godine, the book's original publisher. And I should add, one of those institutions that Slant has been modeled upon. Just to introduce our two guests tonight, both Richard and our interlocutor, I will give you their brief bios, as they say. Richard Rodriguez is one of America's leading public intellectuals, an author and a journalist, equally adept on screen as on paper. He is the author of the autobiographical trilogy on class, ethnicity, and race, Hunger of Memory, The Education of Richard Rodriguez, 1982, Days of Obligation, An Argument with My Mexican Father, 1992, and Brown, The Last Discovery of America, 2002. His most recent book is Darling, A Spiritual Autobiography, 2013. Rodriguez worked as an essayist for nearly 20 years on the PBS NewsHour and has written documentaries for British and American television. To broaden and amplify our conversation with Richard tonight, I've asked an old friend and colleague, Dave Griffith, who has been a long-time student of Richard's writing, to join us. Dave Griffith is the author of A Good War is Hard to Find, The Art of Violence in America. His reviews and essays have appeared in print and online at the Paris Review, Image, the New England Review, and Another Chicago magazine, among many others. He is assistant professor in the Center for University Advising at the University of Notre Dame and an affiliated faculty member in the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values, where he teaches courses in Catholic literature and narrative medicine. Welcome, Dave. And also welcome to you, Richard. Glad to have you both with us this evening. Now, I've told you this before, Richard, but I vividly recall reading Hunger of Memory not long after it came out. I cannot for the life of me recall how the book came into my hands. Perhaps I had just become aware of Godine as a publisher and, trusting in its good taste, took a chance on this book with a very simple, plain cover. But the book changed my life, both because of the compelling voice Philip Lope describes in his introduction to the anniversary edition, but also due to the artful and sensitive intermingling of self-interrogation, self-incrimination, and fiercely independent thought. I was a very white young man, clutching my college degree, but my father had grown up in poor neighborhoods in New York and Miami, and he never, in fact, graduated from college. So as a bookish, introspective lad with that newfound English major college degree, I felt I had found, as Lopate puts it, a kinsman. And that remains true today, nearly 40 years later. I remain profoundly grateful for your influence in my life, Richard, and for this book, among other things. So, to start off and to shut myself up, let me ask you just a question about the literary form of the book, which is both a kind of collection of essays and yet essays that cohere. This is a book published, well before the rage for a book of essays constituting a kind of whole. And so I felt like maybe you were a little ahead of your time there. And it's also a book that is called an autobiography. And it did also appear before the kind of memoir craze that began not long afterwards. So I'm curious about these things, this sort of a whole in parts and this autobiography versus memoir. I don't know if either of those offers you a kind of purchase in beginning to think about the formal qualities of the book, the literary nature of what you attempted.
Well, first off, it's wonderful to be with you, but I also apologize. This is a book that I wrote more than 4 decades ago. I was a young man, unpublished, afraid of the silence, and I had left the university in protest over affirmative action, because I did not then consider myself a minority student, precisely because the experience of becoming a student was what kept me from being a minority. My academic or intellectual life had broadened me so that I felt connected to a grand literary tradition, and to call me a minority in such a situation seemed to me absurd. And so I rejected that label. I rejected affirmative action, even when it came, I remember Dwight Kohler at Yale, when I asked him quite plainly, is the only reason you're hiring me or thinking about hiring me is because you imagine that I'm somehow other, that I belong to some kind of inner city barrio or something. And Dwight didn't say yes exactly to that, but he said, we had to look carefully at your application. And I said, you do know that my impulse as a graduate student was to become you. The whole idea that you would think that you were hiring someone other when you're really recovering your own student in me. So I left the university in this righteous protest, and I began writing this book as individual chapters. The first 2 chapters were the chapters I wrote first, and they appeared in American Scholar, and I began to feel that they were shaping the book. I wasn't confident that I was shaping the book. I felt that the material was leading itself into a book, and the easiest chapter for me to write was a chapter called Credo, which was about my relationship to Roman Catholic liturgy growing up as a boy, an altar boy in Sacramento and knowing the Latin rite with such pleasure and mystery. That was the easiest chapter. The hardest chapter to write was the second chapter about the kind of nasty little boy that I was when I decided that I was going to give myself to my teachers and reject my parents, that I was moving to a new civilization. And I was quite conscious of it. I was embarrassed by them. There's a wonderful scene in Women in Love, D.H. Lawrence, where the boy comes upon, Paul Morrell comes upon his father, who's a coal miner. His father is looking at some of his books, and Paul stands at the door and doesn't make any noise. But the distance between father and son in that instance, it was mine. I come from a father who was extremely intelligent, but had 2 years of grammar school education in Mexico. I came from a very ambitious mother who did not read. There were no books in the house. So my bringing books into the house, my writing my life was already an act of rejection about their life. So finally, it ends up that when my mother sees some chapters published in a magazine of the American Scholar, she writes to me and asks me not to write this book. That the family is one thing, private. Los otros, the strangers outside, are something else. Don't tell our personal life to strangers. Well, I took that letter and I put it in the book. And it was with that kind of complication that I proceeded. In a way, I could not have written this book without my mother having told me not to write it.
Richard, if I might jump in there, I'm often teaching your work to undergraduates, and sometimes to high school students. Some years ago, as I was a high school teacher, and would teach late Victorians, which appeared in Harper's, right? As you know, and the students are always stunned at how vulnerable you are, right? That's a very au courant word, right? To be vulnerable with one, which of course is important, right? We want to, with our people that we love the most and care about the most, be present and vulnerable to them, and so they will trust us. But on the page is a whole other thing. So this revelation that your mother wrote to you and said, no, don't do this, please, reminds me a little bit of Joan Didion, including in some of her essays, her psychiatric evaluations, right? Now, this is a very different thing, of course, but and that at the time probably seemed a little gimmicky to some people. But I wonder, how did you get over that hump, so to speak? How did you rationalize that? How did you maintain a relationship with your mother past that? Because that's what so many, it's a practical question, I suppose, that you might not even remember what those conversations were, but maybe you do. Because I still have those concerns with my own family. My mom, who passed about 12 years ago, there are things I'm only just now writing about in terms of our own conversations. So could you speak a little bit to that? Like, how did you rationalize that decision? I need to put this in the book. This is important that I get it in there. How did that decision come about for you?
Well, see, I wasn't fooling. I wanted the book to be not only an act of rejection, but an insistence on my new citizenship in the larger American stream. And that was really part of my intention. This comes at a time in America when the fact of my being, as the supposition was that I was Mexican, loomed very large. It's one of the ironies of my book that it ends up at bookstores in Berkeley in a section called Latino or Latinx or whatever it is. That's exactly what what I was intent not to write. I wanted to write an American book. And so I told my mother once that she would never meet the author of Hunger of Memory, that she should that's a voice she didn't have to hear, that's a person she didn't have to meet, that it was a different person, that I was a public person there and addressing myself to a different audience. She never was reconciled to that because she didn't understand the strategies of writing and the way one could, one can go on a stage and assume a voice quite different from the voice that your family recognizes. I never have trusted the ability of family to tell you who you are. I remember when I was teaching at Berkeley, there was a pair of students who came to my freshman English class. It was at 8 o'clock in the morning. And these two students sat together. They were very big boys, fullbacks. I don't know what position they played, but they would sit together. There was one of the two men who was really smart, but he was also mean. And whenever I would ask a question of the students, he would smile and he would whisper to his friend. His friend never said anything, and was really he looked like a 200-pound cherub, and I couldn't get him to talk. One day, and it became a contest between the bad student and me as to whether we're going to get the cherub to talk. And one day I asked the class, this is at 8:30 in the morning, these freshman football players who were going to get beaten by UCLA. I asked the class, how do you write about emotions that are beyond words? For example, fear. That normally when we are afraid, we don't say, I'm afraid. We go, we're beyond language. Well, they didn't say anything. And finally, the 200-pound cherub raised his hand. It was the moment that every teacher hopes for, where the silent student says something. And he raised his hand and he started talking about The Witch and the Wizard of Oz, and about how when he was a boy, he saw that movie and was terrified of the Witch and the Wizard. I don't think he had a conclusion to the paragraph, but it was brilliant because I had penetrated his silence. The trouble was that his friend was watching, and his friend knew that I had won. And his friend looked at the cherub, the 200-pound cherub, and the moment in which their eyes met, the cherub stopped speaking. And I never got him back. He went away. I'm quite aware of the way friends silence each other. And whenever I was teaching, especially freshmen or orientation for new students, I always warn students about coming to the orientation with someone they knew in high school, because that person is not going to let you move farther than what they already assume you are. So you have to go down, move yourself to another part of the auditorium. Otherwise, they're going to control you. I still feel that. I still feel the necessity of being among strangers and the freedom of that. The trouble is that, coming as I did from a family that was without resources of money or the glamour of mobility, I didn't know whether I could sound a voice that strangers could understand. And so there was always a tentative, will anybody understand what I'm saying, feeling to what I'm engaged in. One day I was in a hotel in Boston, and the first thing I do when I go to a hotel room is I turn the TV on just to warm up the room. And it was a football game. I won't tell you what team it was because I'll give the story away. But I suddenly saw the bad student from that class. He was a coach of a college team. And I looked at him. He was advising one of the players in a huddle. And I thought, you bastard, you silenced your best friend, who's probably in Arizona someday right now, riding on a freeway. And his wife is complaining because, you go away and I can't reach you. The only nice thing I can tell you about that kid is that his team lost. And there is a God. Be careful of your friends. They will not let you write a book. They will not let you sound a voice. One of my best friends in college was a wonderful poet. Her name was Nell Altizer. She's Tom Altizer, the theologian's sister. She's a very good poet, and she was a very good friend. But she would refer to my books as chicanery. It became a play on the word Chicano. And she wasn't going to let me have that voice. So I had to find you and your students at Notre Dame. That's what you breathed life into me, the reader. I read what Greg was referring to, the article in the New Yorker about the end of of college English classes. But I thought it wasn't sufficient to what we are facing. We're really facing the end of mass readers, of people who know the skill of reading. Because in reading my book, people give me my life. And that was the return exchange, that it was difficult to write this book, to be this naked and this self-flagellating and this disobedient a son. But if the book had not found an audience, that's how I came to be. They breathed life into me, your students. That's no small thing. And I was very lucky, very lucky. I remember one night I was on the Merv Griffin show with Orson Welles. And I was talking to Merv Griffin, who didn't know who I was, but I was pushing Hunger of Memory. And Orson had already come on the show, and he was at the other end of the sofa. And suddenly he says, "I'm very glad you wrote this book." I don't know what Orson had some relationship to Mexico. Maybe he thought it was a Mexican book. I don't know. After the show was over, my publicist the people on the Merv Griffin show gave us back the copy of our book. She said, "Give it to Orson, give it to Orson." Orson Welles was going rather like a scene in that movie where he plays the Mexican in Tijuana. He was going into the parking lot. Well, when we had parked 2 hours before that, there was nobody in the parking lot. And now there was huge crowd. It was like Nathaniel West. There were barriers put up on the side of the crowd to keep the crowd under control, because there was the cast of Falcon Crest, which was a TV, soap opera that was appearing with Joan Collins, I think, was in it. These strange memories that still are part of my life. And so I was trying to reach Orson Welles, who was moving back and forth with a copy of this book. And all of a sudden, this man starts waving at me from behind the barrier. And I said, "You want Orson? You want Orson?" He said, "No, I want you." And I walk over to him, and he hands me a piece of paper and a pen. And it's the first time somebody's asked me for an autograph. And I think to myself, there's Orson Welles. Why aren't you asking him for the autograph? He's one of the greatest filmmakers in American culture. By the time I caught up with Orson Welles in Hollywood, walking to his small Mercedes, I realized that that's the way Orson Welles' life is coming to an end, doing magic tricks on the Merv Griffin show and having an audience waiting for Joan Collins and not paying you any mind. So I there was a time when I was on television and I used to get, I'm talking too much. You have to ask me a question. But when I was on television, people would stop me all the time and ask autographs or say things. Now the mystery, since I haven't been on television for a number of years, is that people will come up to me and will tell me something that I wrote, or that they remember that I wrote, or that they imagined that I wrote, that they've been carrying around in their heads, rather like Mrs. Dalloway walking up Bond Street, having seen the open copy of Shakespeare in the bookstore as she turns. People carry each other's books with them. And she carries this line from a Shakespeare play as she walks up Bond Street. Well, the other day up on Scott Street, a woman came up to me and said, "You wrote something years ago, and I've never forgotten it." And then she recited what I wrote. But in fact, I had never written that. It sounded really wonderful, but I never wrote that. And so I was, my mother told me to be polite, and I was polite. I said, "Thank you, for remembering and for carrying the sentence around with you." But then another day, a few days later, a young woman comes up to me and said, "You give a lecture to my students at this girls' school in Palo Alto." And she told me what I said, and it was precise, and it was accurate. And I realized that she's been carrying me around all these years. That's the life she gives me.
Richard, yeah, I mean, in that first chapter, aria, which is of course a tour de force in every possible definition of that term, you begin with this distinction between being a public person, being a private person, and that fundamental tension between public life and private life just feels to me really fundamental to the book in all kinds of ways. It's something you return to later in the book. For example, later in the book, you talk about the temptation of middle-class people to relieve the anonymity of public life by trying to make it intimate. And so I've been thinking a lot about this in relationship to our kind of neuralgic quest these days to assert identity and to claim identity and to claim that others are not accepting our identity or understanding it. And you must have followed these kinds of things for a long time. Do you feel that this distinction between public and private has been erased, has been broken down in a way that it shouldn't? Or I just feel that it's such a rich, suggestive distinction that I wonder if you've thought at all about these things.
Well, I think a lot about them. I do think that the distinction in America right now, in the popular culture, in our popular life, the distinction is getting more and more dim. And there's almost nothing people are not willing to say in public because the notion of a private language already is foreign to them. When I go to Mexico and I try to tell Mexicans at academic meetings that I am not talking about Spanish, I'm talking about the private language one learns as a child when I talked about the Spanish that I learned. And that cannot be translated. There's no way for me to tell you what my grandmother said because she said it only to me. It wasn't any private communication in the sense that she was saying something bad. But I knew when my friend Tom Keating said, "What did she say to you? What did she say?" I knew that there was no translation, that it was so specifically said to me. And now I think that we really live in a time in which, I don't know, young people are just not being taught that they have the capacity to speak and to listen to language that is private. I have a friend, a woman that you might know. I won't tell you her name. She was telling me about a Vietnamese student that she met recently. He's a high school student. And his complaint about his high school was that no one teaches you how to think about your relationship to other people in the classroom. And I said, well, that's the humanities. That's what we used to call the humanities. The New Yorker calls it the liberal arts, but it wasn't liberal arts. It was that I was taught by D.H. Lawrence, by William Soroyan, by Joan Didion, who lives in Sacramento, to how to talk about yourself in a public way that was different from the way your friends would know you and so forth. The trouble with the education we're giving young people is that we do not know how to, because we don't teach them and the Bronte sisters, we don't teach them about the dynamics of sexual desire, of love that is violent, unfulfilled. That a lot of students are using their own society as students as the basis of their semi-public life, so that they become they gather in the cafeteria by race or by language or by ethnicity or by sexual inclination. There's no student body anymore. There's, oh, that table over there is where the gay students sit, or that table over there is where the Vietnamese students sit, and so forth. That failure, that collapse of a private society that allows you to join a public society is the most serious failure of our education.
Richard, if I could jump in there, I think a lot about, in teaching your work and teaching Joan Didion's work and teaching work by so many different, writers from across, the years about this issue of atomization, right? How do we, in what section of the Barnes and Noble would this person's work, appear? Because that's in many ways how my students have been taught, right? To categorize the things that they take in, so that when it's retrieved, to use that sort of Paulo Freire, banking method idea, right? That you're going to retrieve the information banked within the student, that they know where it is, they know on what shelf that lives, right? And I'm wondering, for you, what's the antidote, right? I mean, what is the antidote to that? I mean, because for what you described earlier about this important decision that you made, but it was resolute, it sounds like, to write your mother's letter into your book, despite the fact that she said don't, right? For reasons that, that sort of blew my mind, I have to say, a minute ago. How do you, what is the antidote? Because if you read the New Yorker, or you read the New York Times, or you read, it doesn't seem like it doesn't matter what news source you're going to read when it comes to this issue. Everyone's going to say the same thing, which is that we've all been shunted off into these groups, and this is a good thing for us, right? So what is the antidote? I mean, I used to think that literature was the thing. I still believe that for myself, but it's a hard sell to people beyond myself, I feel like.
Well, the antidote is constant and playful, but also quarrelsome. I remember I was invited to come back to my high school in Sacramento, which was a Christian Brothers school. The Christian Brothers don't teach there anymore, but it was a very good high school for me because I had a number of really good teachers. And the president or the principal invited me to talk to the gay students. Well, there would be gay students in my high school. Already was mind-blowing because it was such a thing was not discussed. I mean, it would, a boy might be laughed at for being effeminate or not being athletic, but no one talked about being gay in that school. Well, I refused. I said, I didn't want to talk to a room of gay students. It didn't interest me to talk to myself. That I said, if you could give me a group of homophobes, that would interest me. Could you find them? And can you, if I walk into a room and it's been set up for me, and everyone in there is Hispanic, I climb up. I just can't do it. I'm looking, there might be some Chinese boy in the back row. I will speak to him. My eyes go to him. I'm always looking for a way to quarrel with the presumption that my audience is one thing, one person, one type, has had this. Otherwise, you end up with students who say, I didn't experience anything like that at all. And I grew up Spanish speaking, and I speak beautiful Spanish and so forth. What's your problem? I was at Stanford the other day, and the students were really nasty. Everybody was Hispanic. And I said, when I was a student here, my problem is that I used to live in a dormitory called Sarah House. And Junipero Serra now is a problem for Stanford University. I don't know what they call the dormitory now. It's a co-ed dormitory. It's not Sarah House. And right outside the window, right over here, there was something called Sarah Street. And I don't know what it's called now, but I know it's not called Sarah Street. And I want to protest to you. And you're talking to me about Father Sarah and the Indians and what the Franciscans did or did not do with the Indians. I'm telling you that your own school has taken away my culture. That the culture that I grew up with, the Spanish Catholic culture, that I assumed as part of literally the street I lived on at Stanford, is gone. It's just erased. It's politically correct now to just do away with it. And I want to protest that to you. And I want to encourage you to wonder, in all of the sensitivity you have about the Indians, whether or not Leland Stanford, whose university you attend, was so good to the Indians, and what ways you benefit from the cruelties of history. You are the beneficiaries of tragedy, and you better come to terms with that, because that's the nation, that's the experience of education. Am I getting to what you're asking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that this idea that one would walk into an educational environment of any sort, and it's set up to be univocal, is anathema to the way that I was taught, right? Like the novel, for example, is multivocal, right? The sort of like Bakhtin like sort of idea that like it's this polyphony of voices, and that's what's so amazing about it. And that's what I can say honestly, that I was drawn many years ago to your work, because I didn't know anyone like you, right, when I was a young person. And so that's precisely why I was drawn to it. It was another voice that I could bring in to the chorus of influences and voices that I feel like I needed, right? But that I didn't know that I needed, which is the other beautiful thing. So yeah, thank you.
I don't think I knew anyone like me either growing up. And
fair enough.
If I had, I don't think I would have liked me very much. I don't think so. I was, I was playful. I could make the class, a boys' class, boys' school. I could make them laugh at you if you crossed me. But I didn't like you, and I didn't expect you to like me either, because my allegiance was to my teachers. That was really my relationship. It wasn't with other students. I had an extraordinary relationship with teachers. Some of them are still alive, and my best teacher, whose name I will not utter today, talk about breathing life into me. He breathed life into me. He came during Christmas break and sought me out. I was at the library. My father said, "Oh, he's over there in the park." And so we sat in the car, his car, and talked about Tennessee Williams. And I realized now he was talking to me about being gay, not him. Years later, I heard that he was in trouble. He was seriously alcoholic. I mean, seriously. The students at a Catholic college would find him sprawled on the pavement outside of a dormitory in the morning. This is the man who saved me as a child, as a young man, who gave me books, who took me out to a restaurant to show me how you go to a restaurant, I ordered a Roy Rogers. I never knew that there was such a thing called Roy Rogers. And then when he needed something, even a note from me, I turned my back. I didn't save him. Not that I could have, but I used, if you were my teacher, I would use you, but you mustn't expect that I would be nice to you. And I wasn't nice to many of the teachers who were so good to me, but they were my personal relationship. I mean, they're the people, they were my education. It wasn't the club that I joined. It was a relationship to those, they're men. And then the Sisters of Mercy in grammar school, who remained very close to me many, many years later. I would do anything for them, except be nice, because they were too important for me. And so I began to treat them like I would treat my parents. I was both good, sometimes very good, and often very bad.
Now, Richard, you say, of this book that you really wanted to tell an American story. And, that raises, the kind of troubled idea of assimilation, which can of course take on many different aspects depending on, how you're defining it and how you're looking at it. Clearly, if assimilation is looked at in too rigid a way, it is an evil thing. And yet part of me feels that maybe a more ample idea of assimilation, a more hospitable, fluid ideal of assimilation is really what this act of reading and writing, calls us to in some way, that we have to assimilate to one another through these mysterious means of sharing our interiority with each other through this exteriority. I mean, is assimilation salvageable? Is there an American story still to be written?
Well, we keep looking for it. And I mean, this interest now in Black culture in America, Black novels. I think we're looking for a way to broaden our sense of who we are. And we use some really despicable terms like dead white men, that sort of thing. I mean, that's not helpful to me because most of those dead white men helped create me. But nonetheless, this impulse to bring the Black experience, Black voices, Black literature into our lives is very much alive right now. It's as though we don't feel ourselves complete. We need this other part of our national culture. I remember when I was teaching at Berkeley, I had an office in Wheeler Hall, and I had a student, a very stylish young African-American girl. She was about, 19. And she noticed on my desk, I hadn't put it there for her or for anybody, except it was a book I was reading, Achibe's book, No Longer at Ease. And this was 1970s. She looked at it, lifted it up, and played with her thumb along the edge of the book. And she said, "Why are you reading this book?" And I thought to myself, why, since when am I not allowed to read a Nigerian novelist? When did that happen? I remember when I was much younger than that, I was at the Clooney Library in the park, in McKinley Park in Sacramento. And I found a book by James Baldwin. And I sort of knew something about him, but I reached for it. And there was no sense in which I could not hold it, that I could not take it with me home. I think the book was called Nobody Knows My Name, something like that. The notion that all culture is yours is really an important part of the educational process, that you feel confident of belonging to that society. Now, when I was in England as a graduate student, I saw many times when what accent could do, how people could disqualify themselves by not speaking English with the conventional high academic tones. And I didn't want that to happen to me. I wanted to frighten people with my voice. I didn't want them to laugh at my voice. And so I wanted to assimilate their voice into my voice. I think I know that if I ever ended up in Bloomsbury with Virginia Woolf and Leonard, they would have laughed at my speech, at the way I carry on. But I wanted that somehow to be, I wanted to get past it. I wanted to offer them something that they couldn't reject easily. And if that's assimilation, then that's what it was. I could not let them have permission to drum me out of the club. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Absolutely.
This is really urgent for me. But I wanted to be educated. And it embarrassed me, that the scene with the gas station and this teenage boy is talking to my father. My father can't speak to him. He speaks gibberish. And I was so embarrassed by my father's lack of command of the English language that I wanted to run away from my father. And I ran ahead into the night because the embarrassment was so acute. So yes, if you tell me that I sound like an assimilated man, that's what I've been trying to do all my life.
Richard, could you speak a little bit more to, you're talking about assimilation as it relates to the way that you speak or the way that you're heard. There's a moment in Hunger and Memory where you're talking about how upset you are, how condescended you feel your parents were by the church. And you talk about the way that the liturgy was a place that they were really nourished, and the way it was a way that they could find out about themselves. It gave them a way to think richly about themselves and about their lives, and not just about themselves, but everyone, all parishioners. Where does what sort of language is being used there, right? I'm not a theologian, but I am a writer, and I'm sensitive to, I'm a post-Vatican II kid. I was born in 1975. So, I didn't know any other form of the Mass, although I have been to Latin Mass a number of times in my life. What is there in the liturgy in terms of language that might be a way for us to talk to one another, or be in, be in community with one another? We're told that we are in community with one another as members of the church, but is that true? Where are you these days with that, I suppose? It's a really potentially dangerous question, I suppose. But
well,
I feel like you can.
I don't think it's dangerous. I do think that the Catholic Church right now is trying a little bit too much to be unceremonial, to be informal, to meet its audience at a level that it expects its audience to be. But my parents were elevated by the architecture of the church we attended, and by the stained glass windows. They came from Dublin, Ireland, and by the Anton Dorndorf, who was our choir director, the Mozart Mass. My parents did not know German, but my parents recognized the music as being magnificent music, and the church pumped it into us that this was our music, that this is the way we were to worship, with this high ceremony. And I took the liturgy very seriously as an altar boy. And if I was at your mother's funeral, I didn't fool around. I did everything because part of the mystery of that early church, early in my life, was that it was so organized. Nobody shouted out, "Amen, praise be." It was all organized, and we answered the priest, or he answered me when I answered his prayers in the same way over and over again. It was precisely the formality of it that allowed us to pray together, because we suddenly were within an organized. I think of all those times when I used to go and pray with my classmates from the first grade, and nobody snickered, and we got used to it. But it was within the formulas of the prayers that we were reciting every day. You know what I'm saying? That allowed us to pray together and without the embarrassment of stepping out and announcing ourselves in more personal ways. I miss that church because it was. I love singing in choirs. D.H. Lawrence has an essay somewhere about English Protestant hymns, and boy, oh boy, are they good when they're really good. And especially, like in a mining town in the Midlands of England, when you get more people singing together in a loud voice, that is something. That's prayer. And when you get my mother admiring the windows of, I took her to the Vatican, and at the very spot where T.S. Eliot fell down on his knees at the approach into St. Peter's, my mother looked up and said, "This is beautiful." You don't need a PhD to do that. That's what the brilliance of the architecture was. There was nothing condescending about it. And I would have been so respectful at your mother's funeral. I would realize that's. I remember there was a young man found dead in a hotel in Sacramento, and the circumstances of his death I never was quite clear of, but I think he was murdered. And it was very rare in the church that I attended, which is bordering on upper class Sacramento, to get a coffin for a man who was possibly murdered, a young man. And there were 3 people at his funeral. And I looked at the as I was holding at the end when we were praying over the coffin. I was looking at the 2 women who'd come. One, a young woman. I thought maybe a girlfriend, maybe a sister. And I looked at the older woman, when she was worn in time, and nobody was crying. And I took my cue from that. And when we got to the cemetery, there weren't enough males, enough bodies to carry his body. It was the first time I carried death. And I remember walking across the lawn. There was dew on the grass, and there was the smell of the earth and this mound of fresh earth waiting to receive his body. When that was done, when I felt death that was not as heavy as I thought it was going to be, and I could feel his body move with my movements, I went back to school, and the priest dropped me off at the school, and the kids were in the cafeteria having lunch, and I had been to death. I've been to death and back. I can't tell you how that forms you, except it did form me. And it was such a liturgy of such texture and complexity. And part of it was that it was so beautiful. I've written somewhere, I think in the book Darling, the only building in Sacramento that was as beautiful as Sacred Heart Church was the Alhambra Theater, which is a magnificent theater. And they tore it down for a Safeway. But the Alhambra Theater, the Sacred Heart Church, is still there. And they do liturgical concerts on Sunday afternoon, to which all kinds of people come, because music is Anton Dorndorf's Mozart Mass was a way of praying, and my parents knew it.
Yeah, it's fascinating in that chapter Credo, because you say that you're a liberal in all things but liturgy, I think the tendency of our time has been, well, culture is elitism. Mozart is elitism. We should democratize and make everything, as you say in the book, idiomatic, I believe is the word that you use. And yet, isn't the paradox of that without a kind of standard that elevates us, we remain, we don't rise together in a sense. We don't experience a communal experience of the sacred when everything is just just so damn folksy.
Yeah. When the folk mass came to the universities, and I joined in because that's what we did, and but it was never going to be the same as it was just not that. When I was living in London, I used to go to Farm Street, the Jesuit church in Mayfair, because the 11 o'clock mass at Farm Street is Latin, and I was surprised. This is class, but here are people, upper class English and Europeans at this mass, all of whom, when the credo is prayed, know how to pray it aloud. So it was post Vatican II. We were all praying the credo, but we were praying it in Latin together, and that was really quite moving to me. And I realized these people have been educated within these systems, like characters in an Evil and Wild novel, and this was part of their culture. And it was part of my culture too. The trouble with credo, as I say in the chapter that I wrote, is that credo is I believe. I knew that as somebody who spoke Spanish, but to translate that to we believe in God was such a violation and such a rejection of the notion that the priest could summon all of us in his prayer and say credo and encompass us all. Instead, we had to literalize that and turn it into we believe in God. That was an offense to me of some magnitude, I must say. I'm easily offended, I must tell you. But on that point, I thought, this is not translation. This is really something else. The inability to trust the priest, to summon in his voice all of us. Joan Didion has been mentioned several times in this conversation, and I grew up in Sacramento. She was about 10 years older than I was. She went to McClatchy High School across town. She gave me the possibility of being a writer, because I read an essay of hers in Holiday Magazine and mentioned Sacramento. I didn't know you could write about the life that I was living, delivering newspapers for the Sacramento Bee every afternoon. I didn't know that I was living on a literary landscape. And I remember her mother was fairly right-wing, a member of the John Birch Society. I don't know if you know the John Birch Society, but I went to the John Birch Society meetings just because I wanted to. I had heard about them, and they were at the Senator Hotel, and I sat in the back row with this young woman who was a student at Sacramento State University. And at one point, the speaker says, "Look at those two in the back row taking notes, and good for them," he said. "Just take all the notes you want and tell people what you're hearing me say." And all the people in the audience turned around to look at us. And my private fantasy right now is that one of those women was Joan Didion's mother, and that already our lives were crossing that way. He was Episcopalian, and I wasn't. Joan Didion. Big difference. She's buried at St. John the Divine. Her ashes are between her mother on the one side, the John Birch Society member, and her husband, the Irish Catholic John Donne, a very good essayist, by the way. And there she is, perched between a kind of Catholic Hartford, Connecticut, and the right wing, Sacramento, California. There's so much interesting things to say about Joan Didion. Nobody's saying it right now. The people are paying $28,000 for her sunglasses. It's just ludicrous. It's just the whole thing is madness. So, one lets it pass.
Richard, could you speak maybe just a little bit more, just because this is an intersection of things that is delightful to me, your work and Joan Didion's work. I think mainly because for whatever reason, she did not seem to speak very loudly or explicitly about her faith, right? I'm sure she had, some kind of spiritual sensibility about her, but it's not, explicit in her work necessarily. Maybe in her later work when she's talking about, her husband passing and her daughter passing, and those works are beautiful in their own ways. But I'm wondering, when you said a minute ago that you didn't know that when she was writing about where she was from, which is where you were living, that you didn't know that you could do that. What are the other things that you didn't know you could do? What are the other things that you learned only from reading other people that you could do? It's hard for me to imagine that you didn't know, but what are the things that you felt like you knew, that you learned that you could do from reading other people?
The other writer, California writer who was that important to me was William Savarin. And I followed William Savarin's life quite early. In Fresno, William Savarin, and then San Francisco, William Savarin, and then followed him to Hollywood and the bad marriages and difficult times and so forth. And then he came back. Years later, I was at an anniversary of his death in Fresno. They gave me to go on a stage. I refused to ride it. They gave me one of his bicycles that he used to ride around Fresno, and I didn't want to look like a clown coming onto a stage riding a bicycle. But as I was holding that bicycle in my arms, it was really important for me to connect to William Savarin. I thought some of those early essays of his were really magnificent. And what I envy him is that he doesn't end up in an Armenian section of the bookstore. There is no Armenian section of the bookstore. He is that. There used to be a bookstore on Madison Avenue, owned by a wealthy woman. I think, I forgot, her father owned IBM or something. Anyway, they had a whole wall of the bookstore given to literature, which meant basically the books that she loved. And I was really happy to find my second book, Days of Obligation, in that collection. It was with everyone that I loved. It was just there. And then about 3 months later, the announcement comes that the Whitney Museum wants the property, and they tore down the bookstore. So that whole shelf, what I call the white shelf, writers who don't have a color or an accent, but speak within the assimilated voice of England or Australia or France, that they belong together. And that's what I wanted to join.
Thank you.
Richard, one thing that I feel maybe almost prophetic about Hunger of Memory is, and particularly you sketched this out in the chapter called Profession, was your rejection of academia, which is was a big deal. I mean, I know that at the outset of the conversation you said, well, I protested affirmative action and its impact on standards and the ethics of it and all that. And obviously that's true. I'm sure that was very much in your mind, but I think maybe there was something deeper, maybe a sense on your part of the danger of kind of conformism that academia tends to impress. I mean, you became what? A journalist, a freelance writer, you had all the intellectual chops to be a scholar, but I think some instinct in you felt that you just didn't want to be, well, to quote, was it Macbeth, cabin cribbed and confined in that way. So I doubt that you've had many reasons to regret that decision, or maybe have you?
I initially I felt that if I were to remain in the university, that the pressure of those political years was such that the students would really not make it easy for me. And there were schools that I've never been invited to, Notre Dame, one of them, but a school like Stanford. I mean, the faculty would see to it that I would not get invited. To this day, I had some of my worst critics, or the most vocal critics at those schools, and it was easier to recreate oneself within a different milieu, and to be working for a magazine or for a television network, or you ended up with much more freedom. You could say anything you wanted. I remember Bill Buckley once making an appearance on a show, but it aired at 2 a.m, and he'd made a mistake, a large mistake. And he thought to himself, well, nobody's going to be watching that show at 2 a.m. And then the next day, of course, everyone that he meets says, we saw you last night on that show. I've often tested that. I've often tested how far I can go with this. And I'm on the NewsHour, which was a pretty conventional show when I started working for them. They gave me freedom, but I kept inching and inching. And I was playing, but I also had a wonderful producer. And what was the point, after all, if I was just going to end up sounding like somebody from PBS? I wanted to just be odd and different, and I wanted to be Julia Childs. When I was given an award, a TV award that they give people at the Waldorf, I got up and I gave a speech, and I said, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be Julia Childs. I wanted to be really weird. I wanted to drop the turkey on the floor. I wanted to have that shrill voice of hers. I wanted people to say, what is that woman doing? Who is she? That's what I wanted. And my nose was wrong. My lips were wrong. My face was wrong. But I don't look like a weatherman on my television stations. I look like Julia Child. You can get far with Julia Child because everybody thinks they're Julia Child.
Well, one of the things I love about Julia Child is she, said, never apologize for anything that you cook, right? That seems to fit well with your, if I may say so, the impression I get from your own, attitude toward your work, right? I mean, here we are celebrating something you wrote 40 years ago, and you were saying, that in relation to your mother, Mom, you will never meet that person, right? I wonder what that means for you now, right? As you hear it, in a different stage of your career and thinking about new projects and what's possible. You don't want to go back. It would seem like you're probably still that person, I would imagine, that doesn't want to be like everybody else. So what is that? What is left for you? I mean, what are those other dimensions and facets to you?
What's left is death. I'm at a high enough perch now that I can look over the horizon, and I realize that I'm mortal, and that whatever else AIDS did in San Francisco in the years that I was living here. There's a telephone on my desk here, which used to ring a lot with the announcement of death. Somebody has died. Somebody's gone to the hospital. And these are people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. It was like living in war. It was the strange experience that everyone you knew was dying. All this wit was dying around you. It was turning into these emaciated bodies on a bed without any possibility of humor. So my parents were still going to Sears, were still going to Safeway, but that generation of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, and some of my closest friends were all dying. So when I face death now, is all these years later, 40 years later, it's with the same sense of the finality of mortality, but it's a project, and I think about not so much my death right now. I think about it since I suffered injury and was in the hospital and I had to have my brain reconstructed. I think about what it is to survive, and what that opportunity is. One, survival. A young man from a university that I taught at, and who was raised in a Chinese family, speaks wonderful Mandarin, decided that he wanted to learn Arabic. That he had it in his idea that Arabic is the most difficult language. And so he went to the Middle East and he learned Arabic. I quote him in the book called Darling. And he writes to me an email and says that I have met the woman of my life. She's Palestinian, and we're going to get married in Alexandria. And he said, I want you to be there. I have hundreds of thousands of frequent flyer points. I can get there easily enough. But having suffered this injury to my head, I don't trust flights as routinely as I used to. What an air pressurized airplane cabin would do for a 14-hour plane trip. So he says, I want you to be there. No excuses. And of course, I go to a neurologist over at Stanford and he says to me, if I were you, I wouldn't do it. He said, you don't know Cairo. You don't know what you're going to feel like when you get off the plane. And you don't know how to make your way through the city. It's the city you don't know. You lived in London. If something happened to you on the flight to London, that would be different. But I have to tell you, because I have to tell myself that I didn't go to Cairo. And I didn't offer an apology. I just pretended that the invitation did not come. I feel myself growing cowardly in that sense. And I'm sorry for it. That I'm not as brave as perhaps I want to be. When you no longer are a hero in your own eyes, that's a serious diminishment.
Well, Richard, you are, as always, maybe a little too willing to perform self-incrimination on subjects like this, but I appreciate the honesty and the transparency that you bring. You know, as we wrap up here, I just want to say that of all the many pithy things you said, I think my single favorite quote is very simple 3-word sentence you once wrote: books should confuse. And I've really cherished that quote because you know, I'm like anyone else. I grew up thinking that books ought to clarify and answer and boil down and provide the solutions. And your books have always confused me in sort of the best possible way. So I remain enormously grateful to that. And I know that Dave and I are just thrilled to have had this time with you and to celebrate a book you may not, remember the author of that well, but who nonetheless does live with us, as you were saying earlier, someone who's still carried by many, including us. So we're grateful for the witness that you give to so many different fundamental principles that are truly moral, that are, in my opinion, heroic. So
Thank you.
We're just grateful.
Thank you, David,
you.
for giving me my life. It's as simple as that and as profound as that. you give me in my life. No small gift. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dave, as well, and to, of course, to Richard. And I'm going to wrap up now with just a few bits of housekeeping to say that we'll be announcing the date of our next podcast soon. If you're interested in our recent releases, 3 of which came out last month, each of them is related to one aspect that we were discussing with Richard, the realm of religion and ethics. And those 3 titles are Cry of the Heart on the Meaning of Suffering by Lorenzo Albacete, a great Puerto Rican writer, Richard, who I think you should read someday. The other 2 are The Miracle of Hospitality by Luigi Giussani, and Everything I Did for Happiness, The Life of Enzo Piccinini, a fascinating Italian surgeon who died about 25 years ago and whose cause is actually being put forward to the Vatican. You can learn more about these titles, including the different ways to order them, by going to their respective web pages at slantbooks.org. Tonight's episode of SlantCast has been recorded and will soon be available on both our YouTube channel and, of course, wherever you find your podcasts. Remember that you can now subscribe to SlantCast through all the major outlets, including Spotify, Apple, Audible, SoundCloud, and others. Finally, remember to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thanks again, and see you next time.